The pilot didn't recognize Traoré, and the late apology on the final flight. The friend in the back seat. Félix Houphouët-Boigny International Airport, Abidjan, 6:00 a.m. The early rain swept across the runway, leaving long water streaks on the concrete surface. Inside the terminal, the loudspeakers echoed. "Flight to Ouagadougou is preparing for boarding. Please check your gate." Passengers lined up dressed in gray suits, stylish rolling suitcases, and shining watches. They exchanged familiar glances typical of the privileged class, just enough warmth, just enough distance. At the end of the line, a black man stood silently wearing a wrinkled beige shirt, faded khaki pants, and worn-out sneakers. His shoulder carried an old backpack, the kind soldiers used, but now darkened with worn straps lightly dusted. No one paid attention to him. If they did, they merely glanced before turning away. A ticket agent frowned when he stepped forward. "Your economy class, right? Your carry-on is too large. Please check your limits next time." The man didn't argue. He nodded lightly, offering a smile. As he boarded the plane, he chose a seat at the very back by the window. No one sat next to him. He gazed out at the runway, where the raindrops fell pattering and fading away. His face remained calm, but his deep, steady eyes suggested he had seen much more than most people could fathom in a lifetime. A moment later, a group of people boarded. Among them was a white man, a pilot in uniform, holding his cap in hand, with a stern face and meticulously trimmed mustache. He slowly walked down the aisle, stopping at the man's seat. "Good morning, my friend. I see you're not having breakfast." The man looked up. "No, I'm fine." The pilot glanced at the backpack, then at the sneakers. He gave a slight sneer, just enough for those with sensitivity to notice. "If you need an extra meal..." "Sorry, we don't have any leftovers for economy class today." The remark was not exactly rude, but it was cold with enough implication to make nearby passengers start whispering. The man nodded again, offering no reply. He turned his face back to the window. A few minutes later, the cabin door closed. The ceiling lights shifted from white to a soft yellow. The pilot returned to the cockpit, and the cabin fell into the dull hum of the accelerating engines. The man in beige closed his eyes and leaned his head against the wall. He wasn't angry. He had grown accustomed to that look, the look of those who believe that seat positions define the value of a person. A young flight attendant approached, intending to hand out wet towels to the passengers in the back. When she saw him, she paused. She tilted her head and softly asked in French, "Excuse me, may I ask you something?" The man opened his eyes and looked at her. "I saw you in a newspaper a few months ago, at the ECOWAS summit," he smiled, placing a finger to his lips to signal for silence. She was taken aback. He spoke quietly. "I'm just a passenger like everyone else. Sometimes people need to be treated as if they're no one." The flight attendant bowed her head and silently walked away. But her steps were trembling because she had just witnessed something bigger than any first-class ticket, a leader who didn't need to flaunt his position. In the cockpit, the pilot Bernard was flying the plane with seriousness. A Belgian-born Frenchman with over 20 years in African aviation, he thought he understood all types of people on planes. "Those economy-class passengers really have no manners," he sneered at his co-pilot. "As if we owe them a first-class service." The co-pilot said nothing. He just looked at Bernard and remembered the man in beige. There was something unsettling about it, but he didn't dare speak. The flight went smoothly. As the plane descended, the attendant announced, "We're preparing to land at Ouagadougou International Airport. The current temperature is 28 degrees. Please remain seated." The man in the back opened his eyes. He no longer looked outside. He opened his backpack, took out an old handkerchief, and wiped his face. No one knew. The flight was almost over, but a lesson was about to begin. When the plane touched down, the first thing that surprised the passengers was a convoy of escort cars and a military honor guard waiting on the runway. Police armored vehicles and soldiers in full uniform stood in perfect formation. A red carpet was laid from the plane's stairs to the gate. The passengers murmured, Is a head of state arriving? Isn't this just a regional flight? What's going on? Bernard looked through the cockpit window, frowning. Someone important must be on this flight. Then his eyes stopped. And in that moment, he froze. The man in beige stood up, calmly, his old backpack still on his shoulder. He walked down the aisle, his steps causing all the passengers to stare. A flight attendant bowed her head, trembling. A passenger on the left quickly stood up, clearing the path. Bernard watched him through the cockpit glass, his heart racing. It can't be. It's him. It's... A soldier stepped forward and saluted. Welcome back, President Ibrahim Traoré. The entire cabin was engulfed in a suffocating silence. And one man, pilot Bernard, could only stand frozen in the cockpit, his heart pounding, and a wave of shame he had never experienced rising within him. The friend in the back seat turned out to be the one leading an entire nation. We've met before, haven't we? The airplane stairs had been attached to the fuselage. The hot wind from the Ouagadougou ground gently hit Ibrahim Traoré's face as he stepped out first. No bodyguards walking ahead, no flags waving, just a man in a faded shirt carrying a backpack walking down the red carpet, causing the entire honor guard to stand at attention and salute. Behind him, the cockpit door remained slightly ajar. Bernard, the veteran pilot, gripped the handrail tightly, his eyes following every step of the man. Each step was a silent slap to his own smugness. Bernard couldn't understand why he felt so moved. He had flown many heads of state, some boarded with extensive security, some asked for expensive liquor, some refused to shake hands with attendants because they weren't high enough rank. But no one had ever been as silent as the man who just passed by him with such calmness that made Bernard feel small. He left the cockpit. His legs, for the first time in years, trembled slightly. As Bernard stepped down the stairs, the passengers and security personnel had dispersed. Traoré was now standing next to an armored vehicle, hands clasped behind his back, talking with an officer. But his gaze quickly swept and met Bernard's. He stopped. A brief moment, just a few seconds, but Bernard knew Traoré had recognized him. Unable to hide it, Bernard stepped forward. His throat was dry. "Sir, Bernard began, but his words caught in his throat. Traoré turned fully toward him. The wind lightly blew his shirt aside. Under the harsh sunlight, his face remained calm, but no longer the face of an economy-class passenger. It was the face of a man who had learned patience to teach others a lesson. "We've met before," Traoré said in a deep voice. "On this morning's flight, right?" Bernard nodded. He struggled to find words, but none were enough to cover up his own wrongdoings. "I'm sorry. I didn't know. I didn't recognize you, and I said things I shouldn't have." Traoré stepped closer, facing him. "It's all right. You just did what many others would do." "What do you mean?" "You judged a man by his seat, by his clothes, by his shoes." Traoré paused, then looked straight into his eyes. "But a person is not in those things. It's in how they treat others when they think they're nobody." Bernard lowered his head. He didn't know what to say. In his entire life, no one had ever told him that straight. He had been the one flying hundreds of people through the skies, believing the cockpit was the highest position on the plane. But it turned out, the highest position is somewhere among the people. Traoré placed his hand on Bernard's shoulder. "I'm not angry. I just hope, after today, if you see someone sitting quietly in the back, you'll remember that they carry a world like you do." Bernard couldn't say anything else. His emotions shattered inside his chest, not because he was embarrassed, but because for the first time in his life he learned something from a person who never scolded him. He just quietly walked on, letting the truth expose the bias. That evening, Bernard sat alone in his hotel room in Ouagadougou. The soft yellow light from the lamp reflected off a photo frame on the desk, a picture of him standing next to another head of state whom he had flown to Europe. On the TV, a special report showed Traoré stepping off the plane. Journalists continuously commented, no one knew which flight he was on. No one knew he arrived without notice. Once again, the young president has surprised the entire political system with his unassuming simplicity. Bernard turned off the TV. He opened his phone, went to the Notes app. Title, A Lesson from the Back Seat. And in it, he wrote a line, "I once sat in the highest position in the sky, but today I realized I was at the lowest because I couldn't see what was right in front of me." The man in the back seat is the one leading an entire nation. 3 days later, Bernard did something he had never done in 20 years of flying. He asked for a transfer out of his position as captain. In his letter to the airline, he wrote, "I can't continue sitting in the cockpit if I haven't learned how to see through the hearts of passengers." The airline refused his request, but he stood firm. As for Ibrahim Traoré, he never mentioned that flight again. No statements, no criticisms, no mention of the pilot. He simply quietly directed the launch of a new training program for the civil aviation sector. Respect people before you know who they are. At the program launch meeting, a journalist asked, "Do you think a pilot can change after an encounter like that?" Traoré just smiled. Anyone can change, as long as they have a moment of silence to hear what they've just lost. The man in the back seat. I sat next to the emergency exit. "My name is Jonas Cabaret. I'm not a politician. I'm not a reporter. I'm just an ordinary IT employee living in Ouagadougou who used to work remotely for a company in Abidjan." I tell this story because I sat in the middle section next to the emergency exit, just 3 rows from the back seats. And I saw it all. At first, I didn't pay much attention to that man. When he boarded the plane, I noticed he was quite thin, wearing a wrinkled shirt, old shoes, and carrying a faded backpack. He didn't look at anyone. He didn't attract any attention. He wasn't like those politicians I had seen before, those who were always greeted by the attendants seated at the front. He silently made his way to the back and sat down as if he were invisible. But then, there was one thing that caught my attention. It was his eyes. When a middle-aged man traveling with his son asked the attendant for an extra breakfast, the young girl gently responded, "I'll check with the cockpit to see if we have leftovers." The man pointed toward the back of the plane. I doubt that guy even ordered food. Doesn't look like someone who usually flies. At that moment, I turned my head and saw the man in the shirt just bow his head and smile. He wasn't angry. He didn't react. It was just a smile. From someone who had grown used to being looked down upon, and I didn't understand why. But it made my heart ache. When Captain Bernard walked through the cabin to check at the end of the flight, he stopped right by him. I heard his voice clearly. "Hey, buddy, the back section is a bit cramped today. Next time book early. Maybe you'll get a better seat." The man nodded gently, said nothing, and kept his gaze out the window. At that moment, I muttered to myself, "There's something about him. He's not like a regular person." After the plane landed and the shocking events unfolded, the convoy, the army, the red carpet, we all stood frozen. The flight attendant started crying. The man sitting next to me muttered, "It can't be. It's him." I realized I was holding my phone tightly without even noticing. And so that evening I went home, opened my mic, and recorded a new podcast episode for my channel, The Man in the Back Seat. I didn't think it would spread far. I simply told it in a low voice, no background music, no effects. Just simply, I met a man with an old backpack. No one paid attention to him. They treated him like a low-class passenger, but he is our president, and he taught me one thing. Treat everyone kindly, because you never know who's sitting next to you on your flight. I posted the podcast and went to sleep. The next morning, messages flooded in like a wave. Within 48 hours, that podcast had over 2 million listens shared by major websites. BBC Al Jazeera and African Times all reported. A podcast recounts the moment President Ibrahim Traoré was looked down upon on a plane, but quietly taught the world a lesson in kindness. The story from the back seat didn't stop in the media. A week later, the African Pilots Association sent an official apology letter to the office of the president of Burkina Faso, along with a commitment to organize retraining on communication standards with the first course titled Respect Beyond Rank. Meanwhile, I Jonas, the one who told the story, unexpectedly became a guest on many TV shows. But in my heart, there was something more important than all of that. I had once been silent, and this time I didn't remain silent. I spoke the truth, and that truth hurt no one. It only made those who were once arrogant quietly reflect. That day I received an email from the president's office. It wasn't an invitation to a press conference. No award, just an attachment. It was a photo. In the photo, Ibrahim Traoré was standing among a group of children in a rural area, wearing a faded shirt, muddy pants, holding a shovel, and digging the foundation for a school. Under the photo was a handwritten note, "No one is born to stay in the back seat forever. But if you've ever been there, never forget the look of those who remain behind." I cried. Not because I was moved, but because for the first time in my life, I saw a president send a message like that to an ordinary person like me. A flight without a plane. On a clear afternoon in the outskirts of Ouagadougou at the newly established Leadership and Public Service Academy, a training center for civil servants, flight attendants, police officers, and pilots focused on ethical values, social responsibility, and humility and power. A special class had just begun. The classroom had no raised podium. Only round tables, simple wooden chairs, and on the walls, a motto written in both French and Moore. A leader must first be one who knows how to listen. Ibrahim Traoré entered. No entourage, no security, just wearing a simple white shirt and holding an old notebook, no different from any student in the room. But in that room there was one person who was particularly waiting for him. Bernard, the pilot from years ago, now retired from flying and serving as an adjunct professor teaching ethical reflection in aviation. As Traoré walked in, Bernard stood up reflexively. "Mr. President." Traoré smiled, raised his hand to gesture. "In here there is no president. There are only those who have learned something and want to help others understand it sooner." Bernard sat down. On the table in front of him was a printed copy of the podcast The Man in the Back Seat, narrated by Jonas Cabaret. The red pen underlined a passage, "Respect is the only thing you can give away, even when you have nothing left." That day's lesson had no curriculum, no lectures, just a conversation between two people who had faced each other, one who had once carried pride in his heart, and one who had silently changed the world. "I'm still ashamed." Bernard began, his voice trembling. Traoré looked at him without judgment, because a word that seemed harmless could carve into someone like a scar. "Not a scar," Traoré responded, "but a lesson, and that lesson is worth more than any praise." A young flight attendant raised her hand to ask, "Sir, if the pilot had recognized you as the president back then, would he have acted differently? Would that be wrong?" The entire class fell silent. All eyes turned to Traoré. He sat quietly and then spoke slowly. "It's wrong if we only respect those who have a title. A society that respects only based on rank has not yet learned the lesson of humanity." He paused, looking directly at the girl and the entire class. "That day I didn't need better service. I just wished that people who have no titles would also be treated like human beings." Bernard bowed his head. A single tear silently fell on his cheek, not because his mistakes were exposed, but because he had just been healed. At the end of the class, Traoré stepped out. Before leaving, he turned to the class and offered a faint smile. "Each one of us is on some flight. Some are in the front cabin, some in the back. But the most important thing is when the plane has a problem, no seat is immune. And if you learn to love the person sitting beside you, you'll have a first-class ticket in someone else's heart." A week later, a photo of Traoré and Bernard sitting together in class was circulating all over social media. No one expected the one who had once been looked down upon and the one who had been arrogant would sit together at the same table, sharing a lesson, treating people kindly, even when you don't expect anything in return. The national airline of Burkina Faso took inspiration from this for a new campaign. Every flight is a lesson. Every passenger is a human being. The following month, a small book was published titled The Man in the Back Seat, a collection of stories, anecdotes, and lessons from passengers, service industry workers, and even those who had been mistreated for their simple appearance. Author Jonas Cabaret. Foreword by Bernard. And the last words in the book were by Ibrahim Traoré, with the line, "I don't need others to stand when I walk in. I just need them not to ignore when the poor walk by."